We were on the first mission in Pirkei Avos, where we spoke about the transmission of Torah from Moshe all the way to the men of the High Assembly. And they tell us the three, evidently these are the most basic principles or approaches in terms of maintaining the authentic transmission. And what do they say? Having Musunamidin. You should be deliberate in judgment. Va'amidu talmidim harbe. You should try to mentor as many students as you can. Asus yog la Torah. And you should make a fence for the Torah. We'll discuss each one individually. How each one interplays with the other. The first of the three, evidently, if it's first mentioned, evidently it's the most important. You know, we find in the Torah, the first interaction when Eliezer was commissioned by his master, Avram, to seek out a wife for his son, Yitzchak. He had traveled to Mesopotamia, a community called Aram Naraim, and he gave certain criteria in terms of, he prayed to God what would be the appropriate wife for Yitzchak, his future master, the future patriarch of the Jewish people. And when this young maiden had come out, which was Rivka, which ultimately became the wife of Yitzchak, he'd asked her a few questions. And one question, the second question. After the first question, he didn't ask for an answer, but he asked two questions, one following the other. And Rivka, the Forshim, the commentators point out, she answered the first question first and the second question second. Beth, silence your computer, please. And that's a sign of wisdom. Why? The first question is this, she answered the first question first, the second question second. The understanding is this, if a person asks the first question first, evidently that's the most important question to ask. The second question is not as important as the first. Because if the second would have been more important, he would have asked that question first. It's not speaking with the second question is based on the first question. So if that's the case, the person responds knowing and understands that the first question is more pressing to the one who questioned, that person answers the first question first and then answers the second question second. If the Anshe Knesset Gadol, the men of the High Assembly, they present three principles. The first of the three, you should be deliberate in judgment. Evidently, of the three, this is more basic and more crucial for the transmission of Torah till the end of time than establishing, mentoring students, and creating a fence for the Torah. Now we're going to discuss what is the importance. You should be deliberate in judgment. So over here, there's a beautiful Rabbi Yonah. He's the commentator, one of the commentators on Pirkei Avos. He writes, this charge is given to those who give halachic rulings, who disseminate Torah. And he explains that when you respond, it should be with great deliberation. What does the great deliberation means? Very often, a person, especially who is asked, and this is very often happens, first impressions have the greatest impact on a person. First impression, you meet a person, and right away, immediately, naturally, you form an opinion. And very often, to change that is very difficult. Even though unless you see it so clearly, you're wrong, first impressions make an impression. And to undo a first impression is not so simple. A person, especially if he has even a good mind, you're asked a question immediately. You have an approach and you have a response. Very often that response may not be correct and accurate. And he says, factually speaking, as it's proven through experience, that initially when we believe something is as we believe it to be, when we reflect on it a little bit longer, we see it slightly different. It's not as refined and defined as initially we thought it was. And the more you reflect and you contemplate it and you think about it, you not only do you see the flaws maybe in what you had believed, you begin expanding and seeing other things which you didn't even notice initially. This is the concept of having Musunamidin, especially if you're in a position to give halachic ruling to be a decisor. It takes a tremendous amount of restraint or humility, understanding just because you believe it to be immediately the way you see it, it's not. And from experience, proves out very often that you have to reflect. And he cites the Gemara in Sanhedrin that when the High Court of Israel would rule, they wouldn't take the vote till the next day. Innocent or guilty. Why? They would sleep on it. And they would actually enter into discussion throughout the night, deliberating what each of their positions were. Why? Exactly. And the terminology is used, havi machmitzim es adin. The word chometz, if you take water and add it to flour, how does it become leavened? By letting it sit. That fermentation process takes place. So machmitzim means sleep on it. Sleep on it now you're sleeping. Mean you should actually let it sit, let it simmer. And by that simmering and in the interaction, the dialogue that you have, then you come to another understanding of what it is, and you may see it the same way, but you may see other aspects of what initially believed to be, may not be as you believed it to be. Therefore, by deliberate judgment, deliberate doesn't mean say, don't spurt it out immediately. Don't respond immediately. It means you should, even if you are touched immediately and you have a certain approach, you should reflect on it and see all sides of the issue and give it time before you give a final response. He quotes in this week's chapter of Pirkei Avos, we read, Havizor Talmud. When you study Talmud, one has to be exceptionally careful. Sheshigas Talmud olazodon, that a person who's in a position to give rulings, even if it was inadvertent, the mistake wasn't intentional, wasn't deliberate, it's considered deliberate. Why? Because he says, because a person who understands this reality, there's no such thing as, of course, it's possible to make a mistake, even after you deliberate. Nobody's perfect. There's always the human frailty. But if the person immediately, without giving it sufficient research and reflecting, he's considered deliberate. He's a deliberate violator, because knowing that it's impossible to be assured that your ruling is correct unless you give it time and you reflect, therefore the person is held accountable as if he deliberately gave a ruling which was a faulty ruling. So that's having Musunamidin. We're speaking over here to preserve the authenticity of the transmission of Torah that was given at Sinai. How do you preserve that? How do you guarantee it to one's best ability? You can't be too quick when it comes to judgment. The halachic rulings have to be reflected upon, and you have to sleep upon it. It has to be discussed. The Talmud, the Gemara tells us, based on a verse, that if a person studies himself, and he's able to study with a study partner, he's doing the wrong thing. Why? We always say 2 heads are better than 1. Why 2 heads better than 1? Because the reason is because a person, the example I always give, a person writes something. After you write something, you want to proofread. Because very often you can't see where the mistake you have made. Only a third party, a third party who sees it differently, he's able to see maybe what you can't see. So when 2 people enter into dialogue and discuss something, each person is coming from his own vantage point, and the other person doesn't have the conflicts of the one who speaks, says it, and therefore he's able to respond and to point out, and if they're interested in coming to truth, they're able, through both of their involvements, to come to a level of truth. Therefore, it says people study themselves, which could study with others, and they're not really experienced sufficiently to study themselves. Ultimately, they will create foolishness. But people who study together, and it gives an example. We say, Eitz Chaim hin lamachzikim bo. The Torah is like an Eitz Chaim, a tree of life. So the Gemara tells us one lit twig could kindle many twigs. The same thing, by entering into dialogue, you're kindling many and you have illumination. Shlomo Melech says, Ner mitzvah Torah, or the Torah is an illuminator. It illuminates if it's truth. So how do you bring it back? Eitz Chaim, he just as that one twig illuminates others, kindles others, identically enter into a dialogue in Torah with others, you bring about a level of elucidation and you come to a level of truth. That's the Gemara. Also, it says, just as when you want to sharpen a knife, how do you sharpen a knife? If you don't have a whetstone to put it on, you take two blades and you run each over the other. And by running each blade over the other, each blade sharpens the other blade. Identically, when two people of stature enter into dialogue, each one sharpens the other one. So this is having Musunamidin. You should be deliberate in judgment, because only through being deliberate and reflecting are you able to maintain the purity and the authenticity of the Masorah itself. Otherwise, the person is actually communicating something and delivering something which is not accurate. And as we always say, you play the game of telephone, by the time it passes through a few people, it's something which doesn't even resemble and has a semblance of what the original transmission was. Also, he quotes this week's chapter 4. It says in Pirkei Avos over there, the Mishnah, Hagas bahoro libo baro, a person who feels confident, but a little pompous when it comes to deliver halachic decisions. Shota. Shota means he's a fool. Rasha, he's considered evil. Vagas ruach, and he's pompous. Person who feels is pompous, means he feels this right, he has right to give certain types of rulings. He's a fool. Could you imagine going to MIT and you have a high school diploma in physics? You think you're going to lecture to doctorate candidates in physics in MIT? Well, he believes because, they sing his praises in the high school. You understand? You're in the big leagues now. And unless you're really on par, you don't lecture there. A person, when you approach Torah, which is truth and only truth, to approach it with feeling confident and pompous due to your lack of humility, what you say is the right thing, the person, firstly, is a fool. And also, he's evil because ultimately what he's going to deliver is not correct. Thirdly, he's an arrogant person. He's a pompous person. It all reflects in this attitude, well, I could rule. Therefore, even before we speak about mentoring students, because when you mentor a student, how do you mentor a student? By sharing with him the Masorah, the transmission. But if you sharing with him is not something which is accurate and correct, what's the value of mentoring that student? It's not appropriate student. Because what that student is going to convey and transmit and actualize and give direction it's incorrect and it's not accurate. That's having Musunamidin. We had read in yesterday's chapter of Pirkei Avos, it says, the Mishnah tells us that shtika is siyog l'chochma. Silence is offense for wisdom. Silence. That's offense for wisdom. Really, has to do with Musunamidin. You listen. You hear something, you let it simmer. You reflect. Because the more you reflect and the more you contemplate it, that wisdom, you see it accurately. You appreciate it. You'd absorb it. The one who says it may say it accurately and understands it. But for you to fully grasp it and see all sides of it, as the way it was stated, even if it is said correctly, a prerequisite is silence. The fence, what protects wisdom, is silence. Okay, now I was thinking that the Gemara tells us that Torah is compared to three liquids, three beverages: wine, water, wine, and milk. Why these three? Water always flows from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. Therefore, to be able to process Torah and retain it, one has to have humility. One has to be humble, a low spirit. Just as water flows from the elevated location, where does it accumulate? At the low location. So where does Torah accumulate? Meaning where is it retained? In the person who's truly humble. Now it's interesting, we read about Moshe Rabbeinu. God attested the fact he was the most humble person who walked the face of the earth. Moshe Rabbeinu is never referred to as tzaddik. He's righteous, devoutly righteous. That wasn't his claim to fame. His claim to fame was he was the most humble person who ever walked the face of the earth. Even if a person is endowed with tremendous intellect, but if you have that eye, which always interferes with, to see it correctly, you understand, you're not the greatest person to walk the face of the earth. It's only due to his level of humility did he have that level of clarity, because he was negated to God. The Torah does refer to Moshe as Eved Hashem. He was God's servant. What's a servant? What's a slave? In this context, a servant, it's a chattel. A slave has no identity unto himself. The identity of a slave, he's the chattel of his master. That's what a slave is. Moshe, every aspect of his being, his physicality, his intellectualism, everything, his time, it was all dedicated to God. He's Eved Hashem. It was God's servant. There's no I, there's only you. Who do I serve? That's my value. That's my purpose. And you don't see it differently. We say that the person who rules hastily and he has this pompous attitude about ruling, we say he's gas ruach, he's arrogant. Of course, if you understand what you're dealing with, you know, it's interesting. Though there's a squad, it's called the bomb squad. They get a communication. It's questionable whether there's an explosive device. They send the bomb squad. Even the experts have been trained and were on many missions to defuse a bomb. You never know, God forbid, it could blow up and they could be killed or maimed. What if a person goes and he's a very smart person and there was nothing he couldn't dismantle? And he goes with this attitude of confidence, he'll do it. And there's no trepidation. You know what the man is? He's a fool. Because if he would understand and appreciate what he has to diffuse, and even with all the experience and knowledge, you never know what could happen. It could cost you your life. You approach it with the greatest level of trepidation and you focus on it in a way that you hope that you try to understand exactly how to diffuse it. When you approach Torah, which is the ultimate of truth, and understand the ramifications of not understanding it properly, due to your own ego, pompousness, self-centeredness, whatever you want to attribute it to, the man is a fool. He's a fool. And he's an arrogant person. Because if he would only understand the nature of what that was, he would treat it differently. I heard a story somebody said over yesterday, which I don't know if it's accurate, that Rav Steinman, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha, very often the teachers would bring high school boys to be examined, to be interviewed by him. He was the leading Torah sage in Israel, and he was a very smart man. I knew him, I was very close with him. And he would ask the boys, we read yesterday in the weekly reading, that the high priest was only permitted to go into the Holy of Holies once a year on Yom Kippur, no other time. And if he enters any other time, it's literally has very serious consequences. As we saw, his sons entered and they died. They were struck down immediately. Therefore, it says, the Torah says that a high priest, although he's permitted to go to officiate and do the service of Yom Kippur and enter the Holy of Holies, but not whenever he chooses to go. He's not permitted to go there. However, there's an opinion in the Talmud that says that Aaron, during the years in the desert, he was permitted to go there. Permitted to go there. Whenever he chose, not only Yom Kippur, but factually, Aaron did not go there only in Yom Kippur. He never went any other time. So the question is, if you could go whenever you choose to go, why didn't he go? If he had that choice, and God gave him permission to come, so why didn't he go? That's the question he would ask these boys. How often? So he answered him, the Talmud says he never went more than Yom Kippur. Didn't go any other time, other than Yom Kippur. So he asked them why. If he was able to go whenever he chose to go, and he was given permission to go, he should have gone. You have this opportunity to go into the location where you have the presence of God, the holiest location in existence. Why not? So this person said, he said something, which I'm not sure if he said it, but I understood why he did not go, continue whenever he chose to go, and he only went that one time. Is this the reason? There's a story they tell over. It's not they tell over, it's authenticated, the story. We know the Vilna Gaon was his most advanced student by the name of Chaim of Volozhin, said about his Rebbe, his teacher, that normally as we get further from Sinai, the generations become less and less in terms of their proficiency and their clarity of Torah. So therefore we speak about Rambam, Maimonides, the greatest codifier, Rashi. After them, even within their own era, there were no people who are at that level. But especially once that era came to an end, it's called the era of the early commentators or codifiers. It was a different level of person. And therefore you can't argue with those people because the basic argument is attributed to misunderstanding. It's not, I disagree. You don't understand what they said, therefore there's no basis to disagree. However, the Vilna Gaon was a person, although he lived in the 18th century, he was as great as some of those who preceded him hundreds of years earlier, hundreds of years. We're going back to the year 1300, the year 1200. He was as great as them, which was out of the ordinary, out of the ordinary. So the Rav Chaim of Volozhin, he already established the yeshiva of Volozhin, which all the great Torah leaders graduated from that yeshiva. There was a small town in Lithuania called Volozhin. And although he was the leader, what we call the Rashiva of yeshiva, he would go back every once in a while to study with his Rebbe, with the Vilna Gaon, consult with him, study with him. And they were studying the tractate on Sukkah. And they came to a discussion, and they had a question which they had no answer to. They couldn't resolve the question. So Rav Chaim Volozhin, in those days, a Jew traveled by coach, but the coachman was always a Jew. Because non-Jews were always suspect that if they would take a Jew into a forest, as they would travel, they would kill the Jew. They were suspect to murder. So Jews only traveled with Jewish coachmen. So they hire this coach, and Rav Chaim of Volozhin is traveling with a colleague of his. And as they're traveling, in the coachman is an observant Jew, but that's his profession, he's a coachman, that he shares with his colleague the question which the Vilna Gaon had asked, and even the Vilna Gaon had no answer for the question. Had no answer. So they're traveling a few hours. They stop off at an inn for a rest stop. And the coachman says to Rav Chaim Volozhin, I overheard the conversation that you had with your colleague. And I heard the question you asked. He says, I think I have an answer. I think I have an answer. He's a coachman. But of course, he'll give him that respect, the due respect. He says, okay, I'm willing to hear. So he comes down and they're sitting in the inn. And he presents his approach, and he feels it's the right answer. So meaning that what the Vilna Gaon wasn't able to come upon, the coachman came upon the right answer, but he felt, you never know. Maybe if the Vilna Gaon still had it difficult, maybe he doesn't understand and appreciate the true difficulty of what the Vilna Gaon had. So what does he do? He goes immediately, he returns to Vilna. And he presents the answer of the coachman to the Vilna Gaon. And the Vilna Gaon hears the answer, he says, that's the right answer. It's the right answer. And he says to the Rav Chaim Volozhin, he says, I want to meet that coachman. Go seek out that coachman. Tell him I want to see him. Okay? So he goes and seeks him out. And he tells the coachman, the Vilna Gaon would like to see you. So he says, for me to go to Vilna Gaon without preparation, can't go. I don't feel I'm at a position now to see him. I have to review the Talmud first. He looked like he wasn't an ordinary person. Only when I review the Talmud and I feel I'm ready, then I'll go see the Vilna Gaon, because I feel I'm not worthy to speak to him unless I'm at a level that I could speak to him. So I have to review the Talmud. So he says, fine. So what is the end of the story? He never, ever visited the Vilna Gaon. Why? Because he never felt he was ready enough. He understood the dimension of Vilna Gaon. How could I go to Vilna Gaon unless I feel I'm at that level? And he never felt he achieved a level of proficiency that he was worthy to speak to Vilna Gaon, so he never went. Aaron, Moshe Rabbeinu was negated to God. There was no more humble person ever walked the face of the earth as Aaron, as Moshe. Aaron was not far behind Moshe. So in terms of appreciating what it meant to go into Holy of Holies, you feel embarrassed to stand there. If there's any degree of spiritual deficiency within yourself, especially if you feel negated to God, how do you even stand in the presence of God? Yom Kippur, I have no choice. God says you must go into Holy of Holies and officiate on behalf of the Jewish people. But although I give you permission to go at any time, whenever you choose to go, during the 40-year period, I have permission, but I'm not going there. Because unless I feel I'm at a level that I'm worthy to go there, and it's appropriate I go there, I don't go there. That's why Aaron never went, although he was permitted to go there, he never went there. Yom Kippur, he had no choice, he had to go there. But outside of Yom Kippur, to go there, and nobody says, and on Yom Kippur when he went, he did have that sense of shame, that he wasn't where he felt himself where he should have been. As it says, initially when he was asked to begin officiating, when he was installed, he was afraid, he was ashamed to approach the altar, because he felt, since he was involved in the sin of the golden calf, he was unworthy, and he had shame. And Moshe says, no, that's exactly why you're the most qualified, because you have that sense of shame, therefore you're most qualified. Because he had that level of shame, he would not enter into the Holy of Holies. That's exactly it. Having Musunamidin, you have to be deliberate in judgment, 300 IQ, lightning intellect, recall instant. There's no question I can't answer. But when you're coming to transmit the Torah in its most accurate context, how do you approach it? You approach it with trepidation. And you have to be deliberate. You have to reflect. You have to discuss it. And only after you've discussed it and you left no stone unturned, and you went through a fine comb and went through every aspect of it, only then, because you have to give the ruling. And you hope you merit the divine inspiration, assistance to see it right. There's a famous story. There were many years ago, Dr. Spiegel, he's there, Alan. There was a case in Philadelphia. There were Siamese twins born, and they were born where they were connected at the brain. And they had to separate them. They couldn't stay together because they would have died. So the question is, you have to separate them. And halachically, a Jew is not permitted to take a life to save a life. So in this situation over here, how are you permitted to perform this operation? And it was a Jewish couple. And there was in the Philadelphia Tribune, there was a 3-page spread on Rabbi Feinstein's ruling on this. And then the Coop, what was his first name, Alan?
Edward Coop.
I think
Everett Coop.
Everett Coop.
He was the chairman of surgery at Penn at the time before he was a surgeon general.
So he himself, so Rav Moshe writes, Rabbi Feinstein was the world-leading decider who was considered humble beyond your imagination, how humble he was, and how great he was, as great as beyond your imagination, how great he was. So he writes over there, and he knew the Torah on his fingertips, instant recall everything. And he was adept in giving halachic rulings. But this ruling was the first time he was going to rule on this particular case. And he said he fasted for 3 days before he would even attempt to begin researching how to rule on this case. And he prayed to God that he should give him clarity, that he should see it right, and he should not disappoint, that his ruling should be halachically correct. And only then he began researching it, and he gave a decision. The decision was fleshed out 3 pages in the Philadelphia Tribune over there. That was the paper. They were amazed. This Everett Coop was shocked, couldn't believe the dimension and all the aspects, because, he had a son-in-law. Firstly, you have to, before you give halakha rule, you have to find the facts. It just can't be abstract. It's something which has to be applied. So he found out all aspects of what entailed, and based on the facts, he went and gave the halachic ruling. I'm talking about, it was a Kiddush Hashem, it was a sanctification of God's name. A man of this dimension of person, it's like there's nothing he didn't know. Even the leaders in medicine were shocked to see a level of humility and meticulousness that there was nothing he did not address within the context of what he had to do. This having Musunamidin. When you approach there, it's understood. Well, it's life and death, but people, I think you should pull the plug. I think, this is what you should do. Rebbe Yoshev, Zechat Tzarech Levrocha, was the leading Torah decider in his time, passed away maybe 15 years ago, maybe less, 10 years ago. And there's a famous story, this is Alan's area, cardiology. He had a certain issue with his heart. He already was in his upper 90s. He lived till, maybe it must have been about 96. He lived till 104. And he had a certain issue and he needed a certain type of surgery. Otherwise he would die. And there was one surgeon in the United States, wasn't a Jew, and he felt he could do the surgery. And Rav Yoshev gained 8 years on his life because of the success of the surgery. And he came with his team. He would only come if he could bring his team to Israel, his nurses and his equipment. And there was one person who sponsored a private plane was leased, and the plane took this team, and the surgery was done at Shari Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem. Rabbi Yoshev, before he allowed this doctor to do the surgery, he actually interrogated him, because you can only go on that operating table if the odds are a certain 60 to 40, but if to go on the operating table, where the likelihood is you're not coming off the operating table, halachically, you're not permitted. You're going there to die. So it had to be within the realm of possibility or good possibility that he's going to come out of this alive. So after he heard the doctor, he said he was agreeable to go through the surgery. During the surgery, he was awake the whole time. He was awake, and when the surgeon was doing every procedure, he agreed, he made up with the surgeon, he will ask the surgeon certain questions at every stage of the procedure to give him the go-ahead if he could go to the next stage of the surgery. And throughout the surgery, he was as calm as if he wasn't even the patient being operated on. And after the surgery was a success, the surgeon, this non-Jewish surgeon, traveled throughout the United States speaking about this experience with Rabbi Yoshev, how it's as if he wasn't the patient being operated on, and how he would only allow him to go to the next stage of whatever that surgery was, because otherwise everything was a halachic question. And it's not because he was the patient. It was his life. It would be anybody's life. That's the way it would be. Having Musunamidin. Well, Siamese twins, if one dies, what difference does it make? If they both die, it's not simple. We're bound to divine law. It's God's world. Well, I think I'll pull the plug. The person's suffering. Maybe it's up to God to make that determination, how long a person should live or how long should he suffer. Especially if you appreciate what the concept of suffering is to a degree. It's all atonement. There's a story. There was a person, he was a Jewish doctor in Toronto many years ago, maybe 25 years ago, and he gave the order to pull the plug. So the person who died came to this doctor in a dream and said to him, he says, I want to explain you something. Because I did not live that extra time that I would have lived, it was deemed in heaven, I have to come back as a reincarnation. And you're at fault. If I would have lived that extra little time, I would have been free of this world and I would have remained in the world to come until the time of resurrection. But because you gave the order to pull the plug, you're at fault, I have to come back. And I'm faulting you for it. This doctor was so shaken up by it, he became a Baal Tshuva because of this incident. That's how shaken up he was. The person's suffering. Unless it meets halachic criteria, there's no way you could pull. There are times you could pull the plug. Only when, whatever it is, you have to know what you're doing. But it doesn't conform with the halachic criteria, it's considered murder. You're taking a person's life. Since when are you God? But people believe they're in a position they play God. So if a person has a superior intellect, IQ, and he has a proficiency, and now he has to approach a halachic question. We're talking about the authenticity and the purity of Torah. The same Torah was given at Sinai we studied today. How do we know? How do we guarantee that authenticity? Having Musunamidin. You have to be deliberate in judgment. You can't just, because you've had experience, therefore immediate response. It's interesting. We read in the first paragraph of the Shema, it says, Vishinantam levanecha. Shina means you should teach your children, but it means a person has obligation to teach students. Banech el talmidecha. Who are your children? Your students. And this is mentoring students. Person who's a Torah scholar or has Torah knowledge, he has an obligation, as the Rambam says, to teach his fellows some Torah. If you have the ability to disseminate it, you have an obligation to teach it. But why does the Torah use the term vishinantam? In Hebrew, l'shanein means to sharpen. So it says that divrei Torah you chadudim beficha, that the moment the question is asked, you can respond immediately without hesitation. That's how proficient you have to be. It's in the forefront of your mind that you respond immediately. That's why the Torah uses the term vishinantam, from the word l'shanein, shinun, you chadudim. It should be sharp in your mouth, that the moment it's asked, we're not saying regarding in the context of the halachic decision, but somebody wants to discuss a Torah subject matter. Immediately, you should be able to respond. That has to be the level of proficiency and familiarity you have with it. It's not something I have to look up. I hear what you're saying, maybe what. Logically, I think it should be this way, but not the way. It has to be rooted in knowledge. That's how proficient a person has to be. The person who especially who disseminates Torah has to be the pro, the expert, that he should have that recall, that and that instant response. It's interesting. The Talmud discusses, you have a court, and a court, to be qualified on a Torah level, to be a judge on a court, you have to have the ordination Moshe Rabbeinu. It's called smicha, ordination, but it's not the smicha, the ordination we talk about today. A court that could issue certain rulings, such as death penalty, lashes, the judges are only qualified to give those kinds of verdicts and rulings only if they have the ordination Moshe Rabbeinu. How do you have that? Meaning that Moshe at Sinai, he ordained the elders. Those elders, because they themselves carry the ordination of Moshe, they ordain the people they ordain. That's a continuum of the ordination of Moshe Rabbeinu. So as long as you're ordained by a person who initially was ordained by Moshe, and it's part of that chain link unbroken, you're in that position, okay? What happens? Two defendants come, they have a monetary dispute. And the judges make a mistake. They make a mistake. And the defendant who was innocent already paid the claimant. Does the man have to give back the money? Does he give back the money? Do you reverse it? You reverse the ruling. Say, you gave the money, you received money, we made a mistake, give it back. You don't give it back. The judges themselves have to pay out of their own pocket. Why? What's the reason? Because something which you should have known, if you're already sitting as a judge, you should have known the law. So that you didn't know, that mistake is attributed to you. We can't disgrace the court, because if word gets out that the court is not qualified and they make mistakes, the integrity of the court is compromised. So therefore, Chazal said, the rabbi said, if a mistake is made, you don't make it public knowledge it was made. The one who received the money, he keeps it. And now the judges have to compensate the one who paid, because really it was due to the mistake he paid. Okay? Now, but that's only something that's explicit. Something that if you research it, you'll find it. What about something which is called shikul hadas? Shikul hadas means it's based on your intellectual evaluation. There's nothing explicit in Shas, nowhere. But you have to be able to extract it through your evaluation, understanding. That's where the mistake was made. The judges don't have to pay out of their own pockets, because that's already another dimension of greatness. You can't fault them that they didn't know that, because to do that, you have to be at that special level. Something that's an explicit ruling. For instance, today we have a Shulchan Aruch, we have a code of laws, and they ruled something which is contrary to what's explicit in the Shulchan Aruch. Know something? It's your mistake. You should have known it. Or it's in one of the commentators, which is printed. You should have known it. Or there's certain response. You should have known it. Not knowing it, you're held at fault. You pay. We're not going to overturn it, because we can't disgrace the court, that people should see the court as being unprofessional, and therefore the court is totally compromised, and the community will not accept their rulings. But if it's shikul hadas, which is another level, then you do what you don't overturn the ruling, but you don't. The judge is not held accountable that he should have to compensate the defendant who had to pay, which he shouldn't have paid, because he can't be faulted on that. Have Musunamidin, Rebbe Yoshiv, what he was impressed with Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein, his greatness was that he was able to rule from the Gemara. His greatness was, normally people ruled, they cite certain sources back and forth. He also did, but in addition, he had the ability to have a level of clarity. I'll give you an example. A Jew is not permitted to cook on Shabbos. What's cooking? Cooking is only, what about a person wants to fry an egg in the sun? You're in the desert and you put an egg in the desert on a plate and the sun cooks that egg. Is that permitted? On a rabbinic Torah law, rabbinic law, it's permitted. Why? Because all the laws which are the creative activities that are not permitted on Shabbos, everything is learned from the building of the Mishkan. In the Mishkan, what kind of fire did they have? The fire was human fire created by a human being. It wasn't solar. It was human. It was human created fire. So therefore, the Talmud says like this: if it's obvious that it's not a derivative of human fire, then even rabbinically it's permitted. So if you fry that egg directly in the sun, so it's obvious the solar cooked it. What about if you heat a plate in the sun and then you take an egg and you fry it on that skillet, which is hot enough because it absorbed the solar energy? Because since one doesn't know the source of the heat, because one could attribute the source of the heat to fire, therefore rabbinically you're not permitted to do it. Just know that's the basic foundation of cooking on Shabbos, okay? So years ago when the microwave came out, the question is, the microwave cooks with microwaves. Is it permitted on Shabbos? It's clear. If you use a microwave, it's the microwave, so maybe it should be permitted on Shabbos without the question of electricity, because you have to put it on or whatever it may be. Are you permitted to cook with microwaves, if theoretically we possible without turning on the electricity, the source of energy. So he went and showed, in the Talmud it's not discussed microwaves, didn't exist, nobody knew about microwaves. So he ruled, and he cited a Rashi, that Rashi says in the chapter of Shabbos regarding the provision of cooking, when it speaks about you're permitted to cook with solar energy and not man-made heat, fire. Rashi says because since people don't cook by solar, it's considered unconventional. So the reason is not because in the Mishkan they use human fire. Since people don't cook by solar or thermal energy, that's called unconventional. You're only liable for Shabbos if you violate Shabbos conventionally. But he says today that you have the microwave, that's classified as conventional cooking, it's a Torah violation. That's what he extrapolated and deduced from Rashi's commentary in Tractate Shabbos. That's the way he ruled. So that's extrapolation. It's not something explicit. Of course, it's never discussed. But through his dimension of greatness of Torah, he was able to define this particular question based on that. It's interesting. How was one humbled? If you're on the very top, you think you know it all. But when you meet up with a person who knows more than you know, not just a little bit more, you realize how little you know. And people, unfortunately, we live in a time of mediocrity, and somebody has more knowledge than someone else because, unfortunately, people that have such little knowledge, they think this is God's gift to humanity, or he believes he's God's gift to humanity because he has this proficiency and knowledge base. There was a leading Torah sage. When we grew up, there was a company which people on Pesach would buy their products. It was called, in those days, it was called Rokeach. Then they started pronounced as Rokich. You bought Rokich macaroons, Rokeach macaroons, and they used to have various things, various products. There was one product they had that it was a bar of soap. It was red, and on the letters in the bar in Hebrew, it said kasher in the bar, and that was kosher soap. And what did they manufacture the soap for? For women, when they wash dishes on Pesach, that it should not be a question that the source of the detergent is chametz. So this was made specially for Pesach. Okay, so the bar itself was red and green or whatever the color, or white, the letters. Now, where did this come from? Why did they manufacture Rokeach or Rokich? When they were talking, they were business people. But initially, it was established by an observant people. The owners were observant Jews. In Europe, what was soap? Soap was tallow, was made of fat, and non-kosher fat. If you wash a pot with tallow, what happens? And with hot water, it absorbs into the vessel or the dish, becomes not kosher. So they had other means. So let's say that you would have something which normally you would use the way you'd wash it throughout the year, whatever they had. If it had some leavened ingredient, it'd be the same problem. When you wash the pot, the dish, whatever it is, it would absorb with chametz. So there was a great Jew. His name was Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. Yeshiva University is named after him. And he was the chief rabbi, chief decides. He was known as the Kovna Rav. In Kovna, he was the chief rabbi, and he was one of the world leading decisors. And he gave that ruling that people shouldn't mistakenly think that the soap is made of tallow. They should embed in the soap the words Chav Shin Reish Kosher, that people should know this is kosher soap. This was based on his ruling. That's where Rokeach or Rokich, that's where they came up with this idea that people shouldn't confuse that as you use this soap now, you can use soap always. No, it's only, this is the exception, was a special bar of soap manufactured for Pesach, and all the ingredients are kosher, not only kosher-wise throughout the year, but kosher even to meet the standards of what's necessary on Pesach, okay? This person, Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan Spector, Arlene Spector, Seventh Spector from Pennsylvania, who's totally an assimilated Jew, assimilated. He himself is a grandson of this great rabbi. Okay? Now, Rabbi Yitzchak Chanan, he wrote many works of the sponsor, and also commentary. When you begin reading, you open his book and you start reading that. As much as you think you know, what he writes on just the introductory page, another person can write a work, 80 pages, just on the what he alludes to, what he refers to. So you read that, you think you're at what we call the head honcho. You think you know something. You think you're with it. You're humbled immediately. You're humbled. I think I can. When you read what he writes over there, you realize how much it is to know and how much you don't know. That's what it is. So that to be deliberate in judgment, you approach something immediately, you know, off the cuff answer, I think I'm right, I'm a smart guy, this and that, nobody knows as much as I am. But again, that's rooted in being pompous. Because if you truly be humble, and I gave the example before with the bomb squad, because the ruling is not correct, what is the consequence of offering an incorrect ruling? You know, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zech Tzaddik Levrocha, very interesting story. People called him from all over the world with halachic questions. And one time, you know, there's a time differential from Israel to the United States. So the person called him, it was 3 a.m. In New York, it was 3 o'clock in the morning. And the person didn't realize that he called him. So Rav Moshe was awoken with the phone call. So the person realized it and he started, Rav Moshe said, no, just stay on the phone. I'll be with you in 2 minutes or 3 minutes. 3 minutes later, he gets on the phone and he asks him the question. Apologize, he says, oh, it's okay. What's the question? He tells him, he asks the question and he gives him the approach, the solution, whatever it was. Okay? Why did Rav Moshe tell him to wait 2-3 minutes? Because when you awaken, you have to wash your hands. You have to say certain blessings before you re-engage in Torah. So that period of time took time. So he told him to wait 3-5 minutes till he get back on the phone. This story goes back many years ago. A phone call from Israel to the United States was costly. All of a sudden, this person who called him with the question receives a check in the mail for the cost of the phone call that Rabbi Feinstein is reimbursing him for the time that he had to wait for him to get back on the phone. Because he felt he should have been available. Wait, Rabbi Feinstein said, if I'm in that, if people need me, I should have been available. I shouldn't have held him up for 3 minutes. So I'm sure he sent him more than 3 minutes worth of the phone call. I'm just showing you this type of person. So Rabbi Feinstein, very often, when a person would call, he would tell the person who he didn't know to leave a telephone number, to leave a number. Because just in case later he would realize that he somehow missed the point, he always wanted to have the number to get back to that person to inform him whether his ruling was right or not correct. This is how meticulous he was. This having Musunamidin. He was deliberate and he thought a lot quicker than we think. And when he says thought for a minute, that was being deliberate. He didn't give right off the cuff answer. That was deliberate. You know, it's a famous story. As I always say, famous if you know it. There was a great person. His name lived in the 1800s. His name was Rabbi Musunamidin. He was the genius of Poland, in the great Torah sage. And he lived in abject poverty. And he was immersed in Torah day and night. And his wife attended to all the material needs of the family, raising the children, making sure there was food for them. And his wife once says to him, I recognize who you are. I know, you know, your integrity, your concern, but once in a while, show a little empathy. Here I'm struggling, I'm working, I worry where the food's going to come. How could I feed the children? There's no empathy. I don't see any worry on you. This is what she said to him. So he says to her, I want to explain you something. He said jokingly, he says, you realize, and there was no humility between him and his wife. He says, you realize what takes other people months to figure out, I could figure out in less than a minute. I'm blessed with such genius. What you worry in 3 months, I could worry in a fraction of a second. So you don't realize what level of empathy I have for you. That's what he said to his wife. Okay. I'm sure they both laughed, and he went back to his books, and that was the end of the story. Okay. But what is the value of having Musunamidin? To have an accurate transmission. Because if the rulings are faulty, all of a sudden the transmission becomes corrupted. So even before we start speaking about mentoring students, mentor as many students as you can. First and foremost, let's get it straight. What you're communicating, is it correct? Is it God's word or is your word? I'd once said, we'll end with this, the Gemara tells a story, and we just read about, the students. There was a great member of the Tanog period. His name was Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. And he himself had a level of wisdom and genius, one of a kind. And the Roman emperor would consult with him regarding certain matters. And one day he was in Rome, and who does he meet? He meets the daughter of the Roman emperor. And Rabbi Shua Chananya, there's an expression they used to say, ugly as sin. That's how ugly he was. He was so ugly, you couldn't look at him. So she says to Rabbi Shua ben Chananya, how could such beautiful wisdom be contained in such an ugly vessel? How? So he says, something? Your father has the most precious wines. There's no quality wines like the Roman emperor's wines. He says, where does he store them? She says, in earthenware casks. Tell him immediately it's inappropriate. They should take the wine, switch them to gold and silver vessels. Okay? 3 days passed. The Roman emperor calls for a certain vintage of wine. The wine keeper, steward says, it's soured. He said, why? He says, because, lately there was a change of protocol. We switched the wine from earthen casks to gold and silver casks. So sitting in another type of cask, that's why it's soured. Says, who gave that order? He was infuriated. Says, your daughter. He summons his daughter. And she says, yes, I did. He said, why? Because the wisest Jew advised me that's what I should do. So he summons Rabbi Shua ben Chananya. Rabbi Shua ben Chananya says to him, he says, why did you tell my daughter? You knew it's sour. He says, I understand. But it's to learn a phenomenal lesson. Because the Torah, she asked me a question. How could such precious and beautiful wisdom being contained in such an ugly vessel? How? She says, the Torah is compared to wine. Compared to wine. When you take wine in its pristine state, and it is that special wine, it is special. But if you put it even into a gold, which is precious, a precious metal, and it sits there, if the elements of the wine intermingle, the properties of the gold intermingle in the wine, what happens to the wine? It sours. Of course, it's not unadulterated wine. It's wine that has certain properties of gold in it. But you have to have pure wine. But when you put the wine in a cask, an earthen cask, a cask absorbs and gives out nothing. It has no properties of its own. So therefore, the purity of the wine is maintained. The Torah itself is pure. If a person has an ego, very often when he processes something, instead of leaving the information in its pristine, true state, he has a little bit of his own input in it, his own, what we call his own spin. What happens when you put your own spin in that? It's ours. It's not that original, it's not the real product. Therefore, because I am so ugly, my ego, I have nothing to pride myself in. Therefore, the Torah that I have, the wisdom I have, is like in that earthenware cask. She says, but the other colleagues of yours, they're better looking than you are, and they're also great Torah sages. He says, if they'd be uglier, they'd even be greater. So again, that's explicit in the Gemara, and that's the way the Maharal of Prague explains the Gemara. So what is the value of Musunamidin? Everybody has an ego. I think, and immediately, off the hip, we shoot off the cuff. We all have this failing. So you have to take hold of yourself. You have to reflect. Because if you're proven wrong, you're wrong. And if you notice the shortcoming or the inaccuracy of your analysis, then of course you can admit it. That's having Musunamidin. Factually, and that's why if you don't take out the time to deliberate, reflect, and you use the word chometz, let it sit, let it simmer, then what are you? You're an arrogant, pompous person. Because it's only due to your arrogance or you're not willing to see yourself that maybe your evaluation is not perfect. You give it your best. Once you give it your best, then one merits that special divine assistance, hopefully, to give the right ruling. And as a result of that, the communication, the transmission of Sinai remains accurate. Now we can talk about mentoring as many students as you can. To be continued.
Eshkar.
Okay, everybody should be well. We have Daf Yomi at 11 o'clock, 11 to 12.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Take care.